Dakota Territory, winter of 1888. The temperature was 20 degrees below zero, a dry, crystalline cold that felt less like weather and more like the active presence of a hostile god. In this cold, a man could not afford to be useless. And Abel, by the consensus of the 5 men who stood before the settlement's main hall, was useless. The foreman, a man named Finch whose face was a permanent knot of disapproval, pointed a gloved finger not at Abel, but past him, toward the endless white plains. The gesture was an act of erasure. "You're a drain, Abel," Finch said, his voice flat and stripped of all warmth. "A mouth with no hands to feed it. You wander, you stare at rocks, you fill that book of yours with scratches. The work is here. The town's survival is here. You are not another man," the storekeeper simply nodded, his silence a heavier stone than any word. Abel clutched the thin wool of his coat. He held a small burlap sack containing a half-loaf of stale bread, a small block of salted pork, and a flint. In his other hand, inside his coat, he protected his only real possession, a small, leather-bound journal filled with his own dense script and intricate drawings of soil layers, frost patterns, and rock formations. It was the physical proof of his distraction, the very evidence used against him. He was a man who looked down when everyone else looked forward. He saw the world in its foundations, its hidden structures, and they saw a man who simply couldn't lift his eyes to the task at hand. There was no argument to be made. Their logic was as hard and unyielding as the frozen earth beneath his worn boots. In a place like Blackwood Creek, value was measured in cords of wood chopped, fences mended, and bushels harvested. His contributions were invisible, abstract. They were, in a word, nothing. "We're keeping your cows for the town stock," Finch added, a final, practical cruelty. "They'll do more good here than wandering off to die with you." Label didn't respond. His gaze drifted to the ground, to the way the packed snow squeaked under Finch's boot, a sound that told him just how little moisture was left in the air. He made a mental note. The door to the hall closed with a solid, final thud, leaving him alone in the vast, biting silence. The settlement behind him was a small, fragile island of smoke and faint light in an ocean of white. Before him lay nothing but the horizon, a blade of pale blue steel separating the frozen earth from the indifferent sky. He was 24 years old, and he had been voted off the edge of the world. He turned and walked, not toward any specific destination, but away from the only home he had ever known. The first hour was a battle of sheer will against the shock that threatened to freeze him from the inside out. The cold was a physical weight, pressing on his chest, stinging his lungs with every breath. He pulled his thin scarf tighter over his face, but the fabric quickly grew stiff with the frost of his own exhalations. Out here, the landscape was brutally simple: snow, sky, and the skeletal remains of last summer's prairie grass poking through the drifts like broken bones. To survive, he had to think. And thinking was the one thing he had always been good at, even if no one else had ever seen its worth. He retreated into the pages of his memory, to the lessons from a father he barely remembered, a quiet man with dirt under his fingernails who had been a geologist before bad lungs and worse luck brought him west. His father had taught him to read the land not as a surface, but as a story written in layers. "The earth holds its heat, son," he'd once said, crumbling a piece of dark soil between his fingers. "It breathes. You just have to know where to listen." This was the source of his supposed idleness. While other men saw a field to be plowed, Abel saw a complex system of drainage and soil composition. While they saw a rock outcropping as an obstacle, he saw a history of geologic uplift, a clue to what lay beneath. He would spend hours tracing a dry creek bed, not out of laziness, but to understand where water might pool deep underground. He filled his journal with this information, with theories and observations that were utterly useless for the immediate tasks of the settlement. Finch had once snatched the book from him, flipping through the pages with contempt. "What is this nonsense? Pictures of dirt. You're a fool, living in a world that doesn't exist." But that world did exist. It was just deeper, quieter, and infinitely more patient than the world of men. As the sun, a pale, useless disk, began to dip toward the horizon, Abel knew he couldn't last the night in the open. He needed shelter, a break in the terrain, anything to shield him from the wind that was now beginning to howl, peeling the last vestiges of warmth from his body. He scanned the rolling hills, his eyes searching for a language only he could read, a certain curvature of a slope, a peculiar pattern of snowdrift, a place where the earth itself might offer a pocket of mercy. For 3 days, he walked. The bread was gone, the salted pork a distant memory. He survived on melted snow and a grim, burning determination. His world had shrunk to the next step, the next breath, the gnawing emptiness in his belly. He was becoming a ghost on the plains, his thoughts slow and thick like molasses. On the 4th day, as a new wave of even colder air descended, he stumbled. His legs, clumsy with exhaustion, gave way, and he fell into a deep snowdrift against a low, unassuming ridge of dark, volcanic rock. He lay there for a minute, the snow a deceptively soft blanket, and the thought of simply closing his eyes was a powerful siren's call. It would be so easy to let go. But as he pushed himself up, his bare hand brushed against the rock face where the snow had been cleared, and he felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration. A touch of something that was not the biting, absolute cold of everything else. It was a deep, resonant warmth, seeping from the very bones of the earth. His mind, sluggish and fogged with hunger, slowly cleared. He pressed his cheek against the stone. It was real. He began to dig frantically with his hands, ignoring the pain as his fingers went numb, scraping away the snow and frozen soil at the base of the rock. He was looking for the source, the outlet. And then he found it, a narrow fissure, no wider than his hand, from which a plume of vapor, invisible in the warmer months, now condensed into a faint, ghostly cloud in the frigid air. It smelled of damp earth and minerals, the deep, clean scent of the planet's core. Hope, a feeling he thought had frozen solid and died inside him, began to thaw. He spent the next hour widening the crack with a small knife from his sack, the rock splintering and breaking away. He squeezed through the opening into a passage that sloped steeply downward. The air grew warmer with every step. He found himself in a small cavern, no larger than a trapper's cabin, the walls slick with condensation, the air humid and smelling of wet clay. In the center of the chamber, steam rose from a fissure in the floor. It was a geothermal vent. Not a boiling geyser, but a steady, gentle release of the Earth's inner heat. The temperature in the cave was a stable 40 degrees. To a man who had been living at 20 below, it felt like a tropical paradise. He sat down on the damp ground, the warmth seeping into his frozen limbs, and for the first time in 4 days, he allowed himself to believe he might actually live. The warmth of the cave saved his life, but it couldn't fill his stomach. Survival was a temporary state, stability required a system. As his strength slowly returned, his mind began to work, connecting the disparate pieces of knowledge he had accumulated over the years. The cave was warm. The air was moist. The ground was soil, not solid rock. But it was dark. Nothing could grow here. The thought was a dead end, and despair began to creep back in. Then, another idea began to form, born of Finch's parting words, "We're keeping your cows for the town stock, Bess and Clara." The 2 dairy cows his parents had left him. They were hardy, accustomed to the harsh climate, but even they wouldn't survive this winter in the settlement's drafty, inadequate barn. Finch and the others saw them as meat on the hoof, a resource to be consumed. But Abel saw them differently. He saw them as producers, as a source of renewable life. Milk. Butter. Cheese. A living pantry. The idea was absurd, impossible. But the alternative was certain death. He had to try. He spent a day planning, sketching a map in his journal from memory, marking the route back to the settlement. He would need to travel at night, during the worst of the weather when no one would be out. A blizzard was his only hope for cover. He waited 2 days, rationing the last of his energy, until the sky turned a familiar leaden grey and the wind began to rise. He moved under the cloak of the storm, the blowing snow a blinding white curtain that hid him from the world. He reached the edge of Blackwood Creek near midnight. The settlement was hunkered down, lights extinguished, the street silent save for the shriek of the wind. The barn was at the far end of town. He moved like a shadow, his knowledge of the terrain guiding him around the drifts. He found Bess and Clara huddled together in a corner of the barn, their coats thick with frost, their breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. They were cold and weak, but alive. Getting them out was the easy part, the lock was simple. The journey back was a new circle of hell. The cows were reluctant to move, their instincts telling them to stay put. He had to coax them, pull them, guide them through the blinding snow, his own body a shield against the worst of the wind. It was a slow, agonizing procession, a desperate man and two half-frozen animals against the full fury of a Dakota winter. He nearly lost them a dozen times, but he pushed on, driven by the image of the warm, dark cave, a sanctuary waiting in the earth. When they finally stumbled through the narrow opening, collapsing in the relative warmth, Abel felt a sense of victory so profound it brought him to his knees. He had his foundation. Now, the real work would begin. The cave was a shelter, but it was not yet a farm. It was a raw space, a promise that needed to be fulfilled through relentless, back-breaking labor. Abel's first task was expansion. The initial chamber was too small. He needed room for the cows to move, a place for him to sleep, and space to work. Armed with nothing more than his knife and a flat piece of rock he sharpened for digging, he began to excavate. The earth here, warmed by the geothermal vent, was not frozen solid, but it was a dense, heavy clay mixed with stone. Each shovelful was a victory. He devised a system, dragging the excavated dirt out in his burlap sack and dispersing it outside during the brief lulls in the wind, ensuring no obvious pile would betray his location. The work was a slow, grueling rhythm that consumed his days. Dig, haul, dump, repeat. His hands, unaccustomed to such sustained effort, became a landscape of blisters and calluses. His muscles ached with a fire that never quite went out. But with each passing day, the space grew. He carved out two distinct stalls for Bess and Clara, lining them with dry grasses he'd painstakingly gathered from windswept patches where the snow was thin. He discovered a slow, steady seepage of fresh water from a crack in the far wall, solving the most critical problem of hydration for himself and the animals. He dug a small channel to collect it, creating a perpetual, clean source. Food was the next puzzle. He had saved the cows, but now he had to feed them. He became a master forager of the winter landscape, venturing out to collect lichen, dried wintercress, and the bark of certain trees, anything with a trace of nutrition. He learned to husband his resources with a miser's precision, rationing the meager fodder, ensuring nothing was wasted. This is the part of the story that is often forgotten, the unglamorous, repetitive, and deeply lonely work of building something from nothing. If you find value in stories about the quiet, unseen labor that truly changes the world, consider subscribing. Because the result of that labor is where the impossible begins to happen. Abel wasn't just building a shelter, he was creating a self-contained ecosystem, a bubble of life in a world of white death. He was a man thinking his way through a problem, his hands turning abstract knowledge into tangible reality. The foreman had called him a drain, now, he was becoming a source. In the controlled environment of the subterranean farm, a miracle occurred. Shielded from the lethal cold and the relentless wind, with a steady supply of water and a meager but consistent diet, the cows began to thrive. Their coats grew thicker, their eyes brighter. They were not just surviving, they were recovering. One morning, Abel awoke to a new sound in the cave, a soft, low bleating. Bess had given birth. A small, healthy calf, steaming in the gentle warmth, was taking its first wobbly steps. The birth was more than just a new life, it was a tipping point. It meant milk. At first, the milk was a lifeline, a rich, warm source of sustenance that began to mend the damage the weeks of starvation had done to his own body. He drank it sparingly, ensuring the calf had its fill, feeling the strength return to his limbs, the clarity to his thoughts. Soon, however, he had a surplus. The simple fact of that surplus felt like a staggering luxury. It was potential. It was a resource that could be transformed. He thought of his mother, of watching her in the kitchen years ago, turning the summer's excess milk into hard, durable wheels of cheese that would last through the winter. He had watched with his usual quiet intensity, absorbing the process, the details, the chemistry of it all. Now, he accessed that stored knowledge. He had no proper equipment, so he improvised. He used the clean seepage water, the natural warmth of the cave, and ren it derived from the calf's stomach. He built a crude press from rocks and a flat piece of slate. His first attempts were failures, sour, crumbly messes that he fed back to the cows. But he didn't stop. He observed, he adjusted, he recorded his failures and his small successes in his journal. He learned the specific temperament of this cave, its unique humidity and temperature, and how it affected the curing process. Slowly, painstakingly, he succeeded. He produced a small, hard wheel of cheese. It was pale and slightly uneven, but when he cut into it, the texture was firm, the taste sharp and clean. He sat in the dim light of his tallow lamp, eating a slice of his own creation, and understood that he had done more than just survive. He had built a system. In the darkness, deep beneath the frozen, dead earth, he had cultivated a small, defiant pocket of warmth, life, and abundance. The winter did not break. It tightened its grip, burying the territory under layer after layer of snow. The temperature plummeted further, staying below zero for weeks on end. For Abel, however, life had found a stable rhythm. His days were governed by the needs of his small herd and the steady work of cheesemaking. The cave was his entire world, a sanctuary of warmth, the soft sounds of the animals, and the earthy smell of damp soil and aging cheese. He had created a life where none should have existed. One afternoon, while clearing snow from the entrance to his hidden cave, he saw a figure staggering through the drifts. The man was a trapper, his face gaunt and blackened by frostbite, his movement slow and erratic. He was clearly lost and near the end of his strength. Abel's first instinct was caution, the ingrained habit of a man cast out. But the trapper's condition was too dire to ignore. He brought the man inside, into the shocking warmth of the cave. The trapper, whose name was Sam, stared in disbelief. His eyes, accustomed to the endless, brutal white, struggled to comprehend the scene: two healthy cows, a young calf, and Abel himself, looking not like a desperate survivor but like a man at work. Abel gave him a mug of warm milk, then a piece of cheese and the last of his foraged roots. The food and warmth worked quickly, pulling the man back from the brink. "I thought I was dead," Sam rasped, his voice hoarse. "Thought I was seeing things." An angel's barn at the end of the world. He looked at the cows, then at the small stack of cheese wheels aging on a rock shelf. How? Abel didn't explain the geology or the years of observation. He just said, "The ground is warmer here." Sam stayed for 2 days, recovering his strength. He was a practical man who dealt in the currency of survival, and he recognized the immense value of what Abel had created. Before he left, he unslung his pack, pulling out a bundle of prime beaver pelts. "This is for the cheese," he said, pushing them toward Abel. "A wheel of it. These furs will get you a rifle, ammunition, anything you need at Fort Laramie's." Label hesitated, but the trade felt right. It was the first external validation of his work, a recognition from the world of practical men that his useless knowledge had produced something of tangible worth. Sam left, following the route Abel drew for him in the snow, and the story of the ghost farmer of Blackwood Creek began its journey across the frozen plains. While Abel was establishing his subterranean homestead, the settlement of Blackwood Creek was dying. The winter of 1888 was not just harsh, it was an extinction-level event for their way of life. The blizzards came one after another, burying their buildings in drifts that reached the rooftops. The cold was a patient predator, finding every crack in their log cabins, every gap in their defenses. Finch's leadership, once seen as strong and decisive, was revealed to be brittle and unimaginative. His plans were built for ordinary winters, not for this relentless siege. The town's livestock, housed in the barn Abel had fled, began to perish. The structure was too large, too drafty, impossible to keep warm. They died in their stalls, frozen solid. The horses went first, then the sheep, and finally, the cattle, including the ones Finch had confiscated. Each loss was a blow to their collective morale and a step closer to the abyss. The men would haul the frozen carcasses out, their faces grim, the hope draining from them with every animal they lost. Food, once plentiful, became the sole object of their thoughts. The communal stores were rationed, then rationed again. The portions grew smaller, the conversations quieter. Hunger settled over the town like a physical shroud, dulling their minds and sharpening their fears. Sickness, the inevitable companion of malnutrition and cold, began to move from house to house. A hacking cough in one cabin became a fatal pneumonia in the next. The storekeeper, the one who had nodded so silently at Abel's exile, was one of the first to go. There was no strength for proper burials, the ground was as hard as iron. They moved the bodies to an empty shed, a grim, silent testament to their failure. Finch watched it all, the certainty draining from his face to be replaced by a hollow-eyed desperation. He had done everything right, by the book. He had excised the weak link, consolidated resources, and enforced discipline. And it had all amounted to nothing. His system, the one he had believed in so fiercely, had shattered against the reality of a world that did not care for his rules. The whispers started, quiet at first, then more insistent. They were whispers of Sam the Trapper's story, a wild tale of a man living in a warm cave, with milk cows and wheels of cheese, a story that had trickled back to them from a passing messenger. A ghost farmer. A man who had been cast out. A fool who stared at the ground. Desperation is a powerful solvent, capable of dissolving even the most rigid pride. For Finch, the choice had become brutally simple: cling to his pride and watch everyone die, or swallow it and chase a rumor that sounded like a fever dream. He chose the rumor. He gathered 2 other men, the strongest of the few who could still walk any distance, and they set out. They had no real map, only the vague directions passed along by the Trapper's Tail, north of the Black Ridge, where the rocks looked burnt. They traveled for 2 days, their own meager rations nearly gone, their hope wearing thin. They were following the ghost of a man they had condemned to death, praying he had somehow failed to die. They found him not by a map, but by the faint, almost invisible wisp of smoke from the clever chimney he had built into the rock face. They stumbled toward it, calling out, their voices thin and cracked. Abel heard them. He emerged from the cave opening, holding a simple digging spade, his face calm, his body showing none of the starvation that hollowed their own. He looked healthy. Strong. Finch stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The sight before him was an utter refutation of his entire worldview. Behind Abel, in the warm glow from the cave, he could see the flank of a cow. He could smell the scent of warm animals and something else, something rich and alive. He saw the neat stacks of cheese. It was all true. The 3 men from Blackwood Creek stood before the man they had cast out, and the power dynamic of their world had been completely inverted. Finch, the foreman, the leader, looked at Abel, the drain, the fool. His pride was a bitter ash in his mouth. He didn't issue an order. He didn't make a demand. He took off his hat, the gesture a profound act of surrender. "We were wrong, Abel," he said, the words costing him more than any physical labor ever had. His voice was a dry rasp. "We're starving. The women. Everyone. We need help." The other 2 men just looked at the ground, unable to meet Abel's gaze. In the vast, cold silence of the prairie, the question hung in the air, heavier than any stone. What does a man who was left to die owe to the people who tried to kill him? Abel stood there, the digging spade held loosely in his hand, and looked at the 3 men. He saw their gaunt faces, the desperation in their eyes, the way the cold had seeped into their very bones. He remembered the sting of Finch's words, the finality of the closing door, the terrifying loneliness of the frozen plain. The desire for retribution was a hot, sharp thing in his chest. It would be so easy to say no. It would be just. He could turn his back, close the entrance to his sanctuary, and leave them to the fate they had so eagerly assigned to him. He could let the winter finish the job they had started. But as he looked at them, he saw not just his accusers, but a reflection of his own past suffering. He saw hunger. He saw fear. And he saw failure, the failure of a rigid system that had no room for curiosity, for a different way of seeing the world. His own success was not built on strength or aggression, but on observation, patience, and a deep understanding of the earth. To refuse them now would be to adopt the very cruelty he had overcome. Vengeance was their way of thinking, not his. His entire life had been an argument for a different kind of value, a different kind of strength. What was the point of building this small pocket of life if it was only for himself? What was knowledge if it wasn't shared? He gave a slow, deliberate nod. He didn't offer forgiveness, not in words. He didn't demand an apology. He offered something far more practical. "There is cheese," he said, his voice even. "And milk. It will be enough to get you through. But you will have to carry it back yourselves." He turned and went back into the cave. He wrapped several wheels of cheese in burlap and filled 3 large canteens with fresh, warm milk. He gave it to them without ceremony. It was not a gift, it was a transaction. They had come seeking a miracle, and he had given them a ration. He would keep them alive, but on his terms. And his terms were not about power, but about purpose. That spring, when the great thaw finally came and the world returned to green, he did not return to Blackwood Creek. Instead, Blackwood Creek came to him. He taught them, not with words of blame, but with demonstrations. He showed them how to read the land, how to find the subtle signs of geothermal warmth. He showed them how to dig, how to build insulated, subterranean barns that worked with the earth, not against it. He taught them his system. He turned his personal survival into a communal doctrine. His stupidity, his quiet observation, became the foundation of their new prosperity. Abel never held a title, but he became their center, a quiet authority they sought out for his knowledge. He remained a man apart, living in his cave, which he slowly expanded into a permanent, comfortable home. But he was no longer an outcast. He was a founder. The story of Abel and his underground farm became a legend in that part of the territory, a testament to the idea that the most valuable things are often hidden, buried deep, waiting for the right kind of mind, a mind patient enough to look down and listen to the slow, deep breathing of the earth.